Colonel laughs at little girl's firing range request. He couldn't believe this tiny child thought she could handle a military-grade weapon. Until she broke every SEAL shooting record, stunning everyone who witnessed her extraordinary talent. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The morning fog coiled over Naval Station Coronado, swallowing the Spanish-tiled rooftops and muffling the sound of boots on concrete. The thick mist gave the military base an ethereal quality, transforming the rigid structures into ghostly silhouettes. Through this blanket of gray, Mary Johnson walked beside her father, her small hand clutching a battered leather case that seemed too serious for a 12-year-old. "Remember what we practiced," Michael Smith whispered, his weathered face a map of pride and concern. The civilian maintenance supervisor had traded his military career for stability after losing his wife, but he'd never stopped honoring her legacy through their daughter. The Officers' Club loomed ahead, its naval memorabilia visible through windows that glowed with warm light. Mary clutched her mother's silver trident pendant hanging from her neck, drawing strength from the cool metal against her skin. Today marked 3 years since Jennifer Smith's passing during a classified operation, a fitting day to honor her memory. Inside, the bustling club was a sea of uniforms. Conversations about deployments and training exercises created a familiar background noise that Mary had grown up with. She stood out immediately, the only child in a space designed for warriors. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for the range safety officer who could grant permission for what she needed to do today. Colonel John Smith's booming laughter suddenly sliced through the ambient chatter. The officer stood surrounded by a group of SEALs, including Sergeant Robert Brown and Corporal Sarah Davis, both watching their superior with practiced attention. "What's this? Bring your daughter to work day?" the colonel called out, noticing Mary and her father. His voice carried across the room, drawing all eyes to the girl with the mysterious case. Michael stiffened beside his daughter, but Mary stepped forward with quiet confidence. "Sir, I'd like permission to use the precision shooting range today," she said, her voice clear despite its softness. The colonel's eyebrows shot up, and his mouth twisted into an amused smirk. "The shooting range? Little girls should play with dolls, not rifles," he barked, his eyes gleaming with amusement as the assembled SEALs snickered. Mary stood her ground, fingers tightening around the handle of her case. "It's to honor my mother, sir. Today is the anniversary." "Your mother?" The colonel's dismissive tone cut deeper than he knew. "And who might that be?" The girl's chin lifted slightly. "Lieutenant Jennifer Smith, sir." The name hung in the air, unrecognized by some, but causing others to shift uncomfortably. What no one in that room could guess was that Mary's apparent fantasies were forged in the crucible of true loss and a family legacy steeped in military excellence, one that would soon challenge everything they thought they knew about talent, determination, and the inheritance of greatness. Jennifer Smith had been a legend among those who knew what to look for in military records. Her name appeared in redacted mission reports and was whispered in hushed tones during classified briefings. As a Navy sniper, she had set standards that few could match, leaving behind not just records on paper, but a legacy that lived on in her daughter. Mary Johnson had been only 7 years old when her training began. While other children spent weekends at playgrounds or in front of televisions, Mary's Saturdays and Sundays were filled with the distinctive smell of gun oil and the weight of responsibility. Jennifer had been a patient teacher, her whispered corrections never harsh but always precise. "Breathe in, hold, squeeze between heartbeats," she would murmur, as Mary's small hands learned to steady themselves against the weight of practice rifles. Those training sessions had been their secret, moments of connection between mother and daughter that transcended ordinary parent-child activities. Mary had absorbed everything, the discipline, the focus, the methodical approach to marksmanship that had made Jennifer exceptional. Even at such a young age, Mary understood the gravity of what she was learning, treating each lesson with the unwavering concentration of someone much older. After Jennifer's death during a classified operation 3 years ago, Michael Smith had traded his military career for civilian work, becoming a maintenance supervisor at Naval Station Coronado. The transition allowed him to provide stability for Mary, while keeping them connected to the military community that had been their home. Every Monday, Michael and Mary walked the manicured paths of the base together, a ritual that maintained their connection to Jennifer and the life they'd once shared. Mary always wore the silver trident pendant that had belonged to her mother, a symbol of excellence and sacrifice that hung heavy around her neck, both in physical weight and emotional significance. Today marked the anniversary of Jennifer's death, a day that always brought a particular sharpness to Mary's grief. The 12-year-old had awakened with unusual determination, her decision already made. She would honor her mother not with flowers at a memorial, but by practicing the skills Jennifer had taught her on the very range where her mother's records still stood unchallenged. "Do you think they'll let me?" Mary had asked her father that morning, fingers nervously tracing the outline of the trident pendant. Michael had hesitated, understanding both the importance of this request and the resistance they might face. "It won't be easy," he'd answered honestly. "But your mother never backed down from a challenge, and neither should you." With those words echoing in her mind, Mary clutched her leather case tighter as they approached the officers' club, summoning courage with each step. Michael Smith watched his daughter with a mixture of pride and apprehension, the morning sunlight highlighting the creases around his eyes, marks of a man who had weathered far more than just military service. After Jennifer's death during a classified operation 3 years ago, he had made the difficult decision to leave active duty, trading the adrenaline and purpose of battlefield operations for the maintenance supervisor position had been necessary, but not easy. The quieter battles of raising Mary alone often felt more daunting than any combat mission he'd faced. "You're just like her," he said softly as they walked across the manicured grounds of Naval Station Coronado. The base had become their home, a place where Mary could remain connected to her mother's legacy while Michael provided the stability she needed. The silver trident pendant swung gently against Mary's chest as she walked, her posture already showing hints of military bearing despite her 12 years. She'd been unusually quiet this morning. The anniversary always hit her hard. Michael understood the weight of dates, how they could collapse time and make loss feel fresh again. "You know," he began carefully, "some people won't understand why you want to shoot today." His weathered hand rested briefly on her shoulder. "The officers at the club might not get it." Mary's fingers drifted to her mother's pendant, the metal warm against her skin. The trinket had become both talisman and touchstone, a physical connection to Jennifer that Mary cherished above all possessions. "Mom always said skills fade if you don't maintain them," she replied, her voice steady despite the ache inside. "Today of all days, I need to practice." Michael nodded, recognizing the determination that mirrored his late wife's. Jennifer Smith had been exceptional, not just as a sniper, but as a mother who somehow balanced deadly precision with boundless love. The stories of her accomplishments were classified, but her methods and wisdom lived on through their daughter. As the officers' club came into view, its Spanish architecture gleaming in the California sun, Michael felt a familiar tightness in his chest. The military community had been supportive after Jennifer's death, but there were always those who viewed civilians, especially children, as outsiders. Colonel John Smith was notorious for his traditional views on who belonged where on a military installation. "Remember what we discussed," Michael said as they approached the entrance. "Be respectful, but don't let anyone dismiss you." Mary straightened her shoulders, her jaw set with the same quiet resolve that had gotten her through the darkest days after losing her mother. "I won't, Dad," she promised. "I'm a Smith, after all." The Officers' Club buzzed with Monday morning ritual, coffee, laughter, and the comforting presence of tradition. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting golden rectangles across the polished oak floors where naval officers gathered in small clusters. Ship wheels and brass anchors adorned the dark wood-paneled walls, while photographs of famous naval battles lined the corridors like silent sentinels guarding the institution's proud history. Mary Johnson observed it all with the practiced eye of someone who had grown up in this world without truly belonging to it. She noticed how Lieutenant Commander Wilson nodded respectfully to a senior officer, while midshipmen huddled near the coffee station, their voices hushed in deference to rank. The familiar scent of coffee and furniture polish reminded her of countless mornings waiting for her father to complete his maintenance reports. For Mary, these symbols weren't mere decoration, but living reminders of sacrifice. The black and white photograph of Operation Desert Storm brought back memories of her mother explaining tactical positioning. The display case of ceremonial daggers recalled Jennifer Smith demonstrating proper knife handling in their kitchen. Even the model ships in glass cases reminded Mary of the miniature targets her mother had set up in their backyard, teaching patience and precision. While other 12-year-olds decorated their rooms with pop stars and movie posters, Mary's walls featured ballistic trajectory charts and maintenance diagrams. Her civilian classmates collected stuffed animals. She collected spent brass casings from training days, each one representing a lesson learned, a skill honed. The weight of her leather case felt heavier as she stood among these reminders. Base housing had always been a strange middle ground, not quite military, not quite civilian, where Mary existed between worlds. At school, she was the quiet girl who knew too much about weapon systems and too little about popular music. On base, she was the child who didn't quite belong in adult spaces, yet carried herself with the composure of someone far older. Michael Smith watched his daughter from across the room, recognizing the familiar tilt of her chin, the same determined angle Jennifer had shown when facing challenges. He saw how Mary's fingers unconsciously traced the silver trident pendant at her neck, a gesture that had become more frequent on difficult days like today. The pressure to uphold her mother's legacy was invisible to most, but it shaped every aspect of Mary's existence, from the way she meticulously organized her school supplies to how she approached each new skill with methodical determination. It wasn't just about honoring a memory. It was about proving that Jennifer Smith's legacy lived on, breathing and evolving in her daughter's capable hands. Near the main dining area, Colonel John Smith held court, regaling a group of SEALs with tales from his weekend golf game. His boisterous laughter echoed off the polished wood panels as he described an impossible putt on the 17th hole. The colonel's confidence was as thick as his neck, his gestures animated as he commanded the attention of everyone around him. 18 under par, gentlemen. My best game yet, he announced, conveniently omitting the friendly handicaps that had padded his score. Among his captive audience stood Sergeant Robert Brown, his tan face still bearing the marks of recent deployment, eyes watchful and posture military perfect despite his exhaustion. Next to him, Corporal Sarah Davis nodded politely at the colonel's exaggerated tales, her short hair neatly regulation, still adjusting to the intense rhythms of special operations after her recent transfer. The officers' club hummed with Monday morning energy. Coffee cups clinked against saucers, and the smell of fresh pastries wafted from the kitchen. Framed photographs of naval heroes lined the walls, silent witnesses to generations of service members who had passed through these halls. Mary stood before a glass display case containing naval memorabilia, her fingers hovering near but not touching the protective glass. Inside, medals, insignia, and faded photographs told stories of courage and sacrifice. Her eyes lingered on a trident emblem similar to the one hanging around her neck, the symbol her mother had earned through blood and determination. Colonel Smith's voice suddenly shifted from jovial to patronizing as he spotted the 12-year-old examining the display. He broke away from his admirers, boots clicking against the hardwood floor as he approached. "What do we have here?" he announced loudly, drawing every eye in the room toward Mary. A junior historian in our midst? The conversation around them died instantly, replaced by uncomfortable silence. Several officers glanced away, suddenly fascinated by their coffee cups. Sergeant Brown straightened, his expression carefully neutral, but eyes alert, while Corporal Davis shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the colonel's tone. Mary looked up, her spine straightening almost imperceptibly. She recognized this tone, the condescending prelude to humiliation that adults sometimes use with children they underestimated. It was the same tone her civilian school principal had used when questioning her absence on the anniversary of her mother's death last year. The leather case in her hand suddenly felt heavier as all attention focused on her. Mary's fingers tightened around the worn handle, her mother's voice echoing in her memory. "Stand tall when they look down at you." Colonel John Smith's footsteps echoed across the polished floor of the officers' club, each deliberate step announcing his approach. His leather shoes clicked with military precision against the hardwood, drawing attention from nearby tables. The colonel's imposing figure cast a shadow over Mary as he stopped directly in front of her, his chest puffed out with authority. "Little girl, you know this is an officers' club, right? Not a playground," he said, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure others could hear. The question hung in the air, barbed and deliberately crafted to embarrass. Several of the SEALs shifted uncomfortably, while others leaned forward, anticipating the child's discomfort. Mary looked up at the towering figure, her small frame dwarfed by his presence, but her eyes held something that momentarily caught the colonel off guard. The same unwavering resolve her mother had instilled in her through countless hours of training. She didn't fidget or look away, as most children might when confronted by an authority figure. "Yes, sir. My father is submitting his reports. I'm just waiting for him," she replied, her voice clear and steady, polite but unyielding. The colonel's eyebrows raised slightly, perhaps surprised by her composure. Several of the military personnel watching the exchange exchanged glances. Sergeant Brown, standing near the bar, set down his coffee cup, his attention now fully captured by the unexpected confrontation. Smith's gaze traveled from Mary's face down to the worn leather case clutched in her small hands. The case had seen better days, its corners rounded from use, the leather darkened where hands had gripped it repeatedly over the years. "And what's in that?" he asked, pointing at the case with a slight smirk forming at the corner of his mouth. "Looks a bit serious for a toy." Mary's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the handle of her mother's case. Inside were the tools and records of her training, each page of the logbook filled with Jennifer Smith's handwriting, gradually giving way to Mary's own careful notations. The weight of the case represented not just equipment, but a legacy she carried every day. Across the room, Corporal Davis watched with growing interest, her own experience as a woman in special operations, making her particularly attuned to the dismissive tone in the colonel's voice. She took a step closer, sensing something unusual in the young girl's demeanor, a familiarity with military bearing that seemed out of place in someone so young. The tension in the room thickened as Mary prepared to answer, the officers' club suddenly quiet enough to hear the distant sound of aircraft taking off from the naval station runway. Michael Smith rushed across the polished floor of the officers' club, his weathered face a mixture of concern and determination. Years of military discipline had taught him restraint, but seeing his daughter cornered by Colonel Smith stirred protective instincts he couldn't ignore. Before he could reach them, however, Mary's clear voice cut through the tension. "It's not a toy, sir. It's my shooting kit." The words hung in the air, simple yet powerful. A hush fell over the gathered SEALs, the ambient chatter evaporating like morning mist over the bay. Several officers exchanged glances, some with barely concealed smirks, expecting childish bravado to crumble under scrutiny. Others, however, noted something in the 12-year-old's tone that gave them pause, a confidence that seemed incongruent with her age, but eerily familiar to anyone who'd spent time around genuine operators. Sergeant Robert Brown leaned slightly toward Corporal Sarah Davis, whispering, "Kid's got guts, I'll give her that." The female SEAL nodded, her eyes never leaving Mary's face, recognizing something in the girl's unwavering stance. Colonel Smith's expression hardened, his authority visibly challenged by a child who refused to be intimidated. He squared his shoulders, towering over Mary as if physical presence alone could re-establish the hierarchy he believed in. "A shooting kit?" he repeated, his voice dripping with condescension. "And what exactly does a little girl like you know about marksmanship?" Michael finally reached them, placing a steady hand on his daughter's shoulder. The touch wasn't restraining, it was supportive, a silent affirmation that she wasn't alone in this confrontation. "Colonel," Michael began, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd faced worse than military politics. "My daughter has been properly trained." But Mary didn't retreat behind her father's protection. She stood her ground, the silver trident pendant at her neck catching the light as she straightened her posture. The leather case in her hands, worn at the edges from years of use, was held with the reverence of someone who understood its contents weren't just equipment, but extensions of a legacy. Around them, the atmosphere in the officers' club shifted. What had begun as an amusing interruption to Monday morning routine was transforming into something else entirely, a moment where rank and age were suddenly secondary to the unmistakable presence of capability. Colonel Smith's skepticism only deepened, his jaw tightening as he found himself in an unexpected standoff with a child whose composure mirrored the very qualities the military sought to instill in its elite forces. "A shooting kit?" Colonel Smith's voice dropped to a dangerous octave as he eyed the leather case in Mary's hands. His eyebrows arched with exaggerated disbelief. "And I suppose your daddy lets you play with real guns, too? What's next? Combat missions before bedtime?" The officers' club grew uncomfortably quiet. Several SEALs shifted their weight, suddenly finding the nautical decorations on the wall fascinating. Michael Smith stepped forward, his weathered face tightening with the restraint that had become second nature since Jennifer's death. The maintenance supervisor's shoulders squared beneath his civilian clothes, a posture that revealed his military past more clearly than any uniform. "Colonel Smith," Michael said, his voice level despite the muscle twitching in his jaw. "There's no misunderstanding here. My daughter has been trained properly in safety and marksmanship since she was 7. Her mother was Lieutenant Jennifer Smith." The name hung in the air between them. For a moment, recognition flickered across the faces of several veterans in the room. A ghost of memory, a whispered legend. But the colonel's dismissal was immediate and cutting. "Never heard of her." He waved his hand dismissively, as if swatting away an insect. "What was her job? Typist? Food service?" The words struck both father and daughter like physical blows. Mary's fingers tightened around the handle of her case until her knuckles whitened. Her mother's pendant seemed to grow heavier against her chest. Michael's face drained of color. "Lieutenant Smith was a decorated sniper, sir. She served 3 tours and trained half the marksmen who came through this base." Colonel Smith snorted, glancing around at his audience of subordinates for approval. Must not have been very memorable then. Sergeant Brown, standing at the edge of the group, studied his coffee cup with sudden intensity. The recently returned SEAL had heard stories during his deployment. Whispered accounts of impossible shots taken by a woman whose skill had become almost mythological among certain units. Mary felt something inside her shift. The colonel's words weren't just an insult, they were an erasure. Every night her mother had spent teaching her to control her breathing, every weekend spent calculating wind variables. Every story of service and sacrifice, all dismissed as if they had never existed. She met the colonel's gaze without flinching. "My mother saved 16 men during the Kandahar operation," she said quietly, her voice carrying in the silence. She held the base record for long-distance accuracy until the day she died. Captain Johnson, who had been observing from nearby, stepped closer, his professional demeanor unable to mask his growing interest in this unexpected confrontation. Mary's jaw tightened as she spoke, her voice steady despite the tension coursing through her small frame. Her fingers instinctively reached for the silver trident pendant at her neck, drawing strength from the cool metal as she lifted her chin. "My mother was a Navy sniper. She taught me everything she knew," she declared, her eyes reflecting not just defiance, but the burning flame of a legacy she carried every day. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The officers' club fell into an uncomfortable silence. Several SEALs exchanged glances, their earlier amusement evaporating like morning dew under harsh sunlight. Even the bartender paused mid-pour, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Colonel Smith's face remained locked in skepticism, but something flickered behind his eyes, perhaps the first hint of doubt. Captain David Johnson had been observing the exchange from near the memorabilia display. The range safety officer set down his coffee mug and approached with measured steps, his boots barely making a sound on the polished floor. Unlike the colonel, his expression held no mockery, only professional curiosity. "Colonel," he said, his voice calm but authoritative, "if there's a claim of marksmanship training, I believe it falls under my purview to evaluate it properly." He turned to Mary, his tone softening slightly. "Miss Smith, what kind of training have you had?" Michael stepped closer to his daughter, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. The maintenance supervisor's weathered face showed both pride and concern, the familiar expression of a father who wanted to shield his child while letting her stand on her own. Mary took a deep breath, steadying herself. This wasn't just about proving Colonel Smith wrong. It was about honoring her mother's memory. The logbook in her case contained years of careful notes, targets with tight groupings, and her mother's patient instructions written in neat handwriting along the margins. "Sir," she addressed Captain Johnson respectfully, "I've been training since I was 7. Mom started with safety protocols before I ever touched a weapon." Her voice grew more confident as she continued, the technical knowledge flowing naturally. She emphasized proper stance, trigger discipline, and breath control before accuracy. "We practiced weekly until she—" Mary paused, swallowing hard, "until she didn't come home." Several of the older officers in the room shifted uncomfortably, recognition dawning on their faces. Lieutenant Jennifer Smith's name might not have been widely discussed, but her reputation among certain circles was legendary. Captain Johnson nodded thoughtfully, his expression revealing nothing as he assessed the 12-year-old standing before him, with the composure of someone far beyond her years. Mary straightened her shoulders, her posture shifting from that of a 12-year-old girl to something resembling a soldier at attention. Her answer came with precision and confidence that belied her age. "Weapon safety, sight alignment, breathing techniques, trigger control, range estimation," she recited, each term flowing naturally. "My mother started with fundamentals, then moved to advanced skills once I demonstrated consistency." Her small hands gestured slightly as she spoke, mimicking the positions her mother had taught her. Captain David Johnson's eyebrows rose incrementally with each technical term. This wasn't the vocabulary of a child playing pretend or repeating memorized phrases. The range safety officer exchanged glances with Michael, who stood nearby with quiet pride illuminating his weathered features. "Your technical knowledge seems sound," Captain Johnson acknowledged, his professional demeanor softening slightly. "And what's your experience with different weapon systems?" Mary tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, her confidence unwavering. "Mostly bolt-action rifles and some semi-automatics, sir. Mom said consistency matters more than variety until fundamentals are automatic." She paused, then added, "She believed in mastering one platform before introducing complexity." Several of the SEALs who had been snickering earlier now listened with growing interest. Sergeant Brown leaned forward slightly, his recent combat experience making him particularly attuned to the authenticity in Mary's responses. That's actually solid training philosophy, he murmured to Corporal Davis, who nodded in agreement. Colonel Smith shifted uncomfortably, his earlier mockery now seeming increasingly misplaced. The atmosphere in the officers' club had subtly transformed. What had begun as entertainment at a child's expense was evolving into something unexpected: professional respect. Jennifer always did believe in building strong foundations, Master Chief Martin commented, her voice carrying authority that even Smith couldn't dismiss. Taught all her students the same way. Mary's eyes brightened at this additional validation of her mother's methods. For years, her training had been a private ritual, something sacred, shared only between herself and the memory of her mother. Now, hearing her mother's teaching philosophy acknowledged by professionals felt like stepping from shadow into light. Captain Johnson considered the girl thoughtfully. "Those are exactly the principles we teach our marksmen," he said. "Your mother clearly knew what she was doing." Around them, the crowd's energy shifted perceptibly. Skepticism hadn't vanished entirely, but it was now tempered with curiosity and, from some, a grudging respect. Even those who doubted a child could truly master marksmanship skills couldn't deny that Mary Johnson spoke with the vocabulary and understanding of someone properly trained. Colonel Smith cleared his throat, clearly searching for a way to reassert control of the situation that was rapidly slipping from his grasp. The double doors of the officers' club swung open with practiced precision as Master Chief Claire Martin strode into the room. Her arrival immediately commanded attention, not through volume or theatrics, but through the quiet authority that 20 years of naval service had etched into her bearing. The decorations on her uniform told a story few could match. Combat deployments across 3 continents, marksmanship medals that instructors whispered about, and the weathered confidence of someone who had proven herself in the world's most dangerous places. Claire paused at the threshold, taking in the scene before her. The crowd's energy had shifted noticeably, skepticism giving way to curiosity as Mary Johnson stood her ground. The Master Chief's eyes narrowed slightly, her tactical assessment as automatic as breathing. "What's happening here?" she asked, her voice carrying the calm authority that had guided countless recruits through impossible situations. Captain Johnson quickly summarized the situation, explaining Mary's request and the Colonel's challenge. Claire's expression remained neutral, but those who knew her recognized the slight tilt of her head, a sign she was fully engaged. Mary continued answering the captain's technical questions, her vocabulary precise and confident. Claire moved closer, listening intently as the young girl described sight alignment techniques and breathing control methods that went well beyond basic knowledge. When Mary mentioned her mother's name, Claire's posture changed subtly. Recognition flickered across her face, followed by something deeper. Respect mingled with old grief. "Lieutenant Jennifer Smith," Claire said, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the room. The conversations died instantly. "Best natural shooter I ever worked with." The Master Chief's words fell like stones in still water, rippling through the assembled SEALs. It wasn't just an endorsement. It was testimony from someone whose standards were legendary. "We deployed together twice," she continued, looking directly at Colonel Smith. Jennifer could read wind conditions that most spotters needed instruments to detect. She had a gift. Claire turned toward Mary, studying the girl's face with newfound understanding. The resemblance was there, not just in physical features, but in the composed determination that had made Jennifer Smith a legend among those who understood the craft. "I didn't know Jennifer had a daughter," Claire said softly, then added with unmistakable certainty, "But I'm not surprised she passed on what she knew." The Colonel shifted uncomfortably as Claire's endorsement effectively neutralized his mockery. What had begun as an opportunity to put a presumptuous child in her place had transformed into something entirely different, a confrontation with a legacy he hadn't recognized and skills he couldn't dismiss. Mary stood straighter, drawing strength from this unexpected validation. For years, her mother's achievements had lived only in her father's stories and her own memories. Now, in this moment, Jennifer Smith's excellence was acknowledged publicly by someone who truly understood what it meant. Colonel John Smith's face flushed crimson as Master Chief Claire Martin's words hung in the air. His confident smirk faltered, replaced by a tightening of his jaw. The room's atmosphere shifted palpably, the assembled SEALs exchanging glances as they processed this new information. The colonel wasn't just dismissing some random child's fantasy. He was belittling the legacy of Lieutenant Jennifer Smith, a comrade who had given her life in service. Jennifer Smith, the Master Chief continued, her voice carrying the weight of shared battlefield memories, held 3 marksmanship records on this very base. She turned to Mary, her eyes softening. Your mother could read wind conditions better than our meteorologists. Mary stood a little straighter, her fingers instinctively reaching for the silver trident pendant at her neck. For years, she had carried her mother's memory like a private treasure, something to be protected from disbelief and casual dismissal. Now, in this room full of warriors, her mother's skill was being acknowledged openly, her sacrifice honored. Michael stepped closer to his daughter, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. The maintenance supervisor's weathered face revealed both pride and a flash of vindication. He'd chosen to step away from active duty to raise Mary, a decision some had questioned, but the quiet dignity with which they'd preserved Jennifer's legacy suddenly seemed validated. Sergeant Brown, who had been chuckling at the colonel's jokes moments earlier, now studied Mary with newfound respect. I heard stories about Lieutenant Smith during my first deployment, he offered quietly. Never knew she had a daughter following in her footsteps. Colonel Smith cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the situation. Well, that's all very touching, but regulations are regulations. Children aren't permitted on the firing range, regardless of who their parents were. Captain Johnson stepped forward, his professional demeanor unruffled. Actually, sir, with proper supervision and safety protocols, there's precedent for civilian dependents using the facilities, especially for memorial purposes. He glanced meaningfully at the date on his watch, the anniversary of Jennifer's death. Mary felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. For the first time since her mother's funeral, she wasn't just a child with an unusual hobby or a strange obsession. These people, these warriors, understood what she was trying to preserve. They recognized the skills her mother had painstakingly passed down as something valuable, something worth honoring. The grief that had been her constant companion for years felt different now. Not lighter, perhaps, but shared, acknowledged, respected. Master Chief, would it be possible for me to use the range today? Mary asked, her voice steady but earnest. The silver trident pendant gleamed against her collar as she spoke, catching the fluorescent lights of the officers' club. This wasn't about showing off. It was about honoring Jennifer Smith on the anniversary of her passing, a private ritual made suddenly public. Claire Martin studied the 12-year-old's face, recognizing the same focused determination she'd seen in Jennifer's eyes during their joint deployments. The Master Chief's weathered features softened momentarily, memories of her fallen comrades surfacing. I can supervise her personally, she offered, her tone professional but warm. The South Range is clear until 1400 hours. Colonel John Smith's face twisted into a contemptuous sneer, his thick neck flushing red above his starched collar. Oh, really? The little girl wants to play soldier. What's next? SEAL training? His laughter echoed harshly against the naval memorabilia adorning the walls. I've seen weekend hobbyists who think they're marksmen. This is a military installation, not a summer camp. Michael Smith stepped forward, his maintenance uniform a stark contrast to the assembled officers' crisp attire. His hands, calloused from years of service both in uniform and out, clenched involuntarily at his sides. Before he could speak, however, several of the SEALs shifted uneasily, exchanging glances that communicated volumes. Sergeant Brown cleared his throat. Sir, Lieutenant Smith's reputation was significant. His careful choice of words spoke to the respect Jennifer had commanded among special operators. Master Chief Martin's voice cut through the tension, her tone leaving no room for debate. "Colonel, there's no regulation against supervised range use. Family members are permitted access with proper authorization and supervision." She gestured toward the safety protocols posted near the door. "I'll personally ensure all standards are maintained." Captain David Johnson nodded his agreement. "As range safety officer, I can confirm that's correct. With qualified supervision and proper safety briefing, there's no regulatory issue." The colonel's authority was being diplomatically but firmly challenged, and Mary could see the conflict playing across his features. The desire to assert dominance warring with the reality that he was outnumbered by those who outranked him in expertise, if not in pay grade. Corporal Sarah Davis, standing slightly behind her superior officers, caught Mary's eye and offered an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. The subtle gesture of solidarity from the female SEAL wasn't lost on the young girl, who straightened her shoulders in response. "Fine," Colonel Smith finally spat, his pride clearly wounded. "But when this turns into a waste of valuable training resources, I want it noted that I objected." He jabbed a finger toward Mary. "This isn't a place for children's fantasies." Colonel Smith's face twisted with incredulity, his bushy eyebrows shooting upward as he stared at Master Chief Martin. The Officers' Club had fallen into an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the distant sound of aircraft taking off from the Naval Station Coronado runway. "You're seriously suggesting we let a 12-year-old shoot military weapons?" he scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension. The challenge electrified the room, crackling through the assembled SEALs like a live wire. Several officers shifted uncomfortably, caught between military protocol and the undeniable tension unfolding before them. Michael Smith stood rigid beside his daughter, his weathered hands clenched into tight fists. Anyone who knew the maintenance supervisor could see the internal battle raging behind his composed exterior. Rage at the colonel's dismissal of his late wife's legacy, warring with the fierce pride he felt for Mary's composure. His jaw muscles worked silently as he fought to maintain the restraint that had defined his years as a single father. "Sir," Captain Johnson interjected carefully, "with proper supervision and safety protocols." "This isn't some civilian shooting range," Colonel Smith interrupted, gesturing broadly. "These are military-grade weapons designed for combat operations, not for children's entertainment." Mary Johnson remained perfectly still throughout the exchange, her small frame somehow projecting a presence that belied her 12 years. The silver trident pendant gleamed at her neck as she breathed steadily, in through the nose, out through the mouth, just as her mother had taught her during those countless weekend sessions. When she finally spoke, her voice carried clearly across the room, devoid of both fear and bravado. "Colonel Smith," she said, meeting his gaze directly, "if you don't believe my mother taught me anything worthwhile, I'd be happy to show you." The offer hung in the air, a child's challenge to an institution steeped in tradition and hierarchy. Several of the SEALs exchanged glances, impressed by her composure, if not yet convinced of her skill. Sergeant Brown leaned slightly toward Corporal Davis, whispering, "The kid's got guts, I'll give her that." The colonel's face flushed deep red, caught in an unexpected tactical dilemma. To refuse would suggest fear of being proven wrong. To accept meant potentially humiliating a child, or worse, being humiliated by one. Master Chief Martin stepped forward, her decorated uniform carrying the weight of battlefield authority. "I'll personally supervise," she stated, not a question, but a declaration. The offer hung in the air, not just a challenge to Colonel Smith's authority, but to the very notions of who could inherit the skills and traditions that defined their world. Colonel Smith's eyes gleamed with malicious anticipation, his posture radiating confidence as he surveyed the 12-year-old standing before him. The promise of humiliation hung in the air like a tangible force. "Fine," he announced, loud enough for everyone in the Officers' Club to hear. "Let's see what kind of training you got from your so-called expert mother." The emphasis he placed on the word training dripped with sarcasm, drawing uncomfortable glances from several of the SEALs present. Mary Johnson stood her ground, clutching her worn leather case tighter. She had faced this kind of dismissal before, the disbelief, the condescension, but never with so much at stake. This wasn't just about proving herself. It was about honoring her mother's memory. "I'll arrange for the range immediately," Captain David Johnson said, stepping forward with professional authority. "But this will be conducted with full safety protocols and proper supervision." His tone made it clear this wasn't negotiable. "If we're doing this, we're doing it by the book." Michael Smith moved protectively closer to his daughter, his weathered face a mask of controlled emotion. "Mary knows the protocols," he said quietly. Jennifer never compromised on safety. The mention of Mary's mother's name caused Master Chief Claire Martin to nod in agreement. Lieutenant Smith was meticulous about range discipline, she confirmed, her experienced eyes evaluating Mary with newfound interest. As the group began organizing the impromptu demonstration, Sergeant Robert Brown leaned toward Corporal Sarah Davis. "The colonel setting himself up for something," he whispered. "Did you see how that kid handled the safety questions?" Mary felt her heart pounding against her ribs, the silver trident pendant at her neck seeming heavier than usual. Doubt crept in, not about her abilities, but about performing under such intense scrutiny. What if her hands shook? What if the pressure was too much? Captain Johnson approached with a clipboard. "We'll need your father's written permission," he explained, handing Michael a form. "Standard procedure for minors on the range." As her father signed the document, Mary took a deep breath, remembering her mother's words from years ago. "Pressure is just concentrated attention. Use it to sharpen your focus, not break it." She nodded with quiet determination, the same resolve that had carried Jennifer Smith through combat missions now flowing through her daughter's veins. The colonel might expect failure, but Mary wasn't planning to give him the satisfaction. "I'm ready when you are, sir," she said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. Colonel Smith's smirk widened. "Oh, we're all ready for this little show," he replied, gesturing toward the door. "After you, little lady. Let's see if fantasy meets reality." The walk to the firing range took them across the naval base, past the familiar Spanish architecture that defined Naval Station Coronado. Mary Johnson kept pace with Master Chief Claire Martin, her small boots matching the instructor's confident stride. Behind them, Colonel John Smith followed with obvious skepticism etched across his face, while Michael Smith watched his daughter with quiet pride. The late morning sun had burned away the coastal fog, revealing a clear sky with a steady breeze coming off the Pacific. Perfect shooting conditions for most, but challenging for someone unaccustomed to the peculiarities of this particular range. "The wind here can be tricky," Claire whispered, leaning slightly toward the young girl. Her voice carried the weight of experience earned through countless hours behind a scope. "Your mother and I spent hours reading mirage and flags. Jennifer could spot a wind shift before anyone else." Mary nodded, absorbing the information with the seriousness of someone far beyond her 12 years. The silver trident pendant bounced gently against her chest as she walked, a constant reminder of the legacy she carried. "Mom said environmental conditions matter more than equipment for consistent accuracy," she replied, recalling one of the many lessons taught during their weekend sessions. "She showed me how to watch heat waves to judge distance and wind." The Master Chief's approving nod was more than mere encouragement. It was recognition of kindred skill, a silent acknowledgement that Jennifer's teachings had taken root. The marksmanship instructor studied the girl's composed demeanor, seeing echoes of her former colleague in Mary's determined gait and attentive eyes. "Your mother could outshoot most of the men with half the equipment," Claire added, just loud enough for Colonel Smith to overhear. She never blamed her tools. Captain David Johnson walked ahead, already preparing the range protocols, while Sergeant Brown and Corporal Davis exchanged curious glances. the small procession made its way past the administrative buildings toward the shooting facility, an area Mary had only observed from a distance until today. "Are you nervous?" Claire asked, noticing the girl's hand drift to her pendant. "No, ma'am," Mary answered honestly. "Mom always said nervousness is just energy that hasn't found its purpose yet." The Master Chief couldn't suppress a smile. "She told me the same thing before our qualification tests." As they approached the range entrance, Michael quickened his pace to walk beside his daughter. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. No words necessary between them. Today wasn't just about proving Colonel Smith wrong. It was about honoring a promise made years ago on this very range, when Jennifer had first placed a training rifle in her daughter's hands and whispered, "Someday, you'll show them all." The morning sun glinted off the steel targets as the group assembled at the precision shooting range. Chief Robert Davis, a man whose 20 years of range supervision had earned him a reputation for uncompromising safety standards, approached Mary with professional scrutiny. His weathered face revealed neither skepticism nor favoritism as he gestured toward the safety station. "Before anyone touches a weapon on my range, they prove they know how to handle it," Chief Davis announced, his voice carrying the weight of authority that had kept countless service members safe. Mary nodded, her posture straightening instinctively. The chief began his assessment without preamble. "Weapon condition?" he asked sharply, watching Mary's reaction with the same intensity he'd use with seasoned operators. Mary answered without hesitation, her voice clear and confident. "Visual and physical chamber check, never trust someone else's word." She demonstrated the proper technique with her hands, mimicking the movements her mother had drilled into her countless times at their kitchen table. Behind them, Colonel Smith crossed his arms, his expression a mixture of impatience and anticipated vindication. Michael Smith stood nearby, his face a careful mask, hiding the storm of emotions beneath. "Malfunction?" Davis continued, his rapid-fire questioning designed to catch the unprepared. "Stop. Maintain muzzle discipline. Engage safety. Call for help. Never clear complex jams alone," Mary replied, the words flowing naturally. She added, "Mom always said overconfidence with malfunctions gets people hurt." The mention of her mother caught Davis's attention. His eyes flickered briefly toward Master Chief Martin, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. "Range commands?" Davis pressed on. "Cease fire means stop immediately, weapon down, step back from the firing line. Range hot means authorized to fire. Range cold means all weapons cleared and secured," Mary recited, her discipline evident in every word. Davis's demeanor shifted subtly. The 12-year-old girl before him wasn't reciting memorized phrases. She understood the principles behind them. He ran through 6 more safety protocols, each answered with the same measured confidence. "What's your first action upon picking up any firearm?" he asked finally. "Check if it's loaded, sir. Always assume it is until personally verified otherwise," Mary responded, her eyes steady. Davis's respect was immediate and genuine. In 20 years of supervision, he'd seen trained adults fumble these basics, yet this child had mastered what many forgot under pressure. He turned to Captain Johnson with a professional nod. "She knows her safety protocols better than some of our qualified personnel," he stated simply. "I have no safety concerns allowing her on this range under proper supervision." From the sidelines, Sergeant Brown whispered to Corporal Davis, "The kid actually knows her stuff." Mary stood a little taller, her mother's pendant catching the sunlight as she prepared for the next challenge. With safety protocols complete, Mary opened her leather case with practiced hands. The assembled officers leaned forward, expecting childish toys or makeshift equipment. Instead, they found professional-grade hearing protection, ballistic glasses with anti-fog coating, and a meticulously maintained logbook. Each page contained detailed notes in neat handwriting, range conditions, grouping measurements, and adjustments for different environmental factors. Lieutenant Sarah Brown knelt beside the shooting bench, preparing the M16 rifle. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency, but her eyes kept darting to Mary's logbook. The entries weren't just records. They were a methodical progression of skills that many adults never mastered. The young girl's attention to detail reminded Sarah of her own training journey, though Mary had begun hers at an age when most children were still learning multiplication tables. "We'll start at 25 meters, 5 shots, standard scoring," Captain David Johnson announced, his voice carrying the weight of official evaluation. He positioned himself behind the firing line, clipboard in hand, ready to document whatever happened next. Colonel Smith stood with arms crossed tightly against his chest, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. His posture radiated absolute certainty that this charade would end in embarrassment for everyone involved, especially Michael Smith, who watched his daughter with quiet confidence. Mary approached the shooting position with measured steps. She donned her protective gear with the same deliberate care her mother had taught her, checking each item twice. The hearing protection, adult-sized and professional grade, nearly swallowed her small ears, making her appear even younger against the military backdrop. "Remember your fundamentals," Michael called softly from behind the safety line, his voice barely audible over the range fans. Mary nodded once, her focus already narrowing to the task ahead. She settled into position behind the rifle, her movements fluid and practiced. Her breathing slowed visibly as she established her natural point of aim. Small hands found their place on the weapon with surprising familiarity, not gripping too tightly, but with the controlled pressure her mother had demonstrated countless times on weekend mornings. The assembled military personnel watched in silence as Mary's body transformed. The nervous 12-year-old girl seemed to disappear, replaced by something unexpected, a shooter whose form mirrored techniques taught in advanced marksmanship courses. Her cheek welded to the stock, eyes aligned perfectly with the sights, breathing pattern established in the rhythmic rise and fall of her shoulders. Captain Johnson glanced at Master Chief Martin, whose slight nod confirmed what they were both seeing. This wasn't play acting or mimicry. This was muscle memory built through hundreds of hours of proper instruction. Mary's finger hovered near the trigger guard, waiting for the final command to fire. The crack of the rifle split the morning air, its report echoing across the sun-drenched range. Mary's first shot found its mark with unerring precision, the paper target showing a perfect hit, dead center of the bullseye. Commander Michael Foster, who had volunteered to call the shots, couldn't hide his surprise. "Dead center, bullseye," he announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet range. Colonel Smith snorted dismissively, his arms still crossed defensively across his chest. "Anyone can get lucky once," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Even a child." Mary didn't respond to the taunt. Instead, she cycled the bolt with practiced efficiency, her small hands moving with the fluid confidence of someone who had performed this action thousands of times. Her breathing remained controlled and rhythmic as she settled back into position, cheek welded to the stock, eye aligned perfectly with the scope. The second shot rang out. Another perfect hit, touching the first hole. "Another bullseye," Commander Foster called, his professional tone now tinged with growing admiration. The third shot followed quickly. Then the fourth, each one landing with impossible precision, enlarging the single ragged hole in the center of the target rather than creating new points of impact. Mary's final shot completed the tight grouping that would have impressed even the most seasoned marksman. A wave of murmurs rippled through the gathered personnel. Captain Johnson stepped forward to examine the target through his binoculars, his eyebrows rising incrementally with each confirmation. "That's not luck," Sergeant Brown whispered to Corporal Davis beside him. "That's skill. Pure skill." The SEAL's face showed the dawning recognition that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Master Chief Martin stood silently, a knowing smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She'd seen this level of natural talent only once before, in Mary's mother. Colonel Smith's face had drained of color. The target told a story he couldn't refute or dismiss. The grouping was tighter than many of his SEAL operators could manage, easily surpassing qualification standards that grown men trained for years to achieve. Quarter-inch grouping at 25 meters, Captain Johnson announced officially, his voice carrying the weight of verification. That would qualify as expert in any military branch. Mary lowered the rifle carefully, engaging the safety before setting it down. Her movements remained precise and disciplined, just as her mother had taught her. She didn't smile or celebrate. For her, this wasn't about showing off. It was about honoring a legacy that lived in her hands, her eyes, her steady heartbeat. The skepticism that had followed her onto the range had transformed into something else entirely, a collective awe that silenced even her harshest critics. Colonel John Smith stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief as he stared at the target. The tight grouping of shots, almost a single hole, mocked his earlier condescension. The little girl he had dismissed so casually had just outperformed seasoned combat veterans. His mouth opened, then closed, words failing him, for perhaps the first time in his military career. "That's a quarter-inch grouping at 200 yards, Captain David Johnson announced, his voice carrying across the now-silent range. "I've seen qualified snipers who can't shoot that tight." The captain's professional demeanor couldn't quite hide his amazement as he examined the target through his binoculars. Mary lowered the rifle with practiced care, her movements deliberate and precise, just as her mother had taught her. She engaged the safety and placed the weapon on the shooting bench, muzzle downrange, before stepping back. The discipline in her actions spoke volumes. Sergeant Robert Brown whistled softly. "I've been through 3 deployments, and I've never seen shooting like that from someone twice her age." Around him, other SEALs nodded in agreement, their earlier skepticism transformed into undisguised respect. Michael approached his daughter, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. His eyes glistened with unshed tears, pride radiating from every line of his weathered face. Jennifer would have been... His voice caught, emotion overwhelming him momentarily. "Perfect form," Corporal Sarah Davis commented, examining Mary's stance. "The breathing control alone, that takes most recruits months to master." Colonel Smith finally found his voice, though it had lost its earlier arrogance. "That was impressive," he managed, the words clearly difficult for him. He glanced at the logbook Mary had brought, now understanding it contained years of meticulous training notes, not childish fantasies. Master Chief Claire Martin stepped forward, her experienced eyes evaluating not just the performance, but the composure Mary had shown under pressure. The marksmanship instructor reached into her pocket and withdrew something small and gleaming. "Your mother and I trained together," she said, her voice carrying the weight of shared history. "She always said, if she had a child, she'd pass on everything she knew." Master Chief Martin extended her hand, revealing a small brass casing. "This was from her qualification day. She'd want you to have it." Mary accepted the offering with trembling fingers, adding it to her mother's pendant around her neck. "Your mother would be proud," Master Chief Martin said, her eyes reflecting both loss and continuity. "And so are we." In that moment, surrounded by the military community that had first rejected, then embraced her, Mary understood something profound. Her mother's legacy wasn't just a memory preserved in photographs and stories. It lived in her steady hands, her disciplined mind, and her unbreakable spirit, a living testament to courage that even the most hardened skeptics could no longer deny.